I'm Shelby Williams with Plano City Council. Tonight, September 14th, we adopted the tax rate for the next fiscal year, which starts October 1st. But first, the preliminary open meeting. We had a report from the 2020 Census Complete Committee. They have done yeoman's work in a pandemic year. We didn't have a pandemic in 2010 that they had to work through like this. So congratulations to the entire committee for working through these conditions and getting an outstanding response rate, which was just a hair below what we got in 2010 ratio-wise. And all things considered, that should be considered a giant increase. We then discussed the City of Plano legislative program. It was basically a framework. How are we going to approach advocating for legislation as a city government? We had a robust discussion about the portions of it where it said that the city may advocate for this, that, or the other. And Deputy Mayor Pro Tem Riccardelli and I had two different interpretations of that. Ultimately, it's going to come back before us with revised language. I had read it to say the city may take a position, and I read that to be that nothing is guaranteed. We may or may not take a position over something. Deputy Mayor Pro Tem read it as permissiveness. The city may do this and was concerned that it may circumvent council authority. So we're going to button that up and bring it back. But one of the things that we will be doing, it appears, is seeking a reduction of the fee assessed by the state comptroller on processing our sales tax. Currently, it's just a 2% fee. That amounts to $1.8 million a year for processing our sales tax returns and distributing that appropriately. That's kind of like a credit card company. Good gig if you can get it, but we're trying to unget it. So we're proposing that that be capped, or we spend a lot less than that. So one of the concerns was that the statements in it were too generic, and that's what we're going to be addressing with revised language. Part of it is meant to be definitive policy statements. Part of it is meant to be approach by bills that will come up and be filed in Austin that we are not aware of yet. We then went to future agenda items. This is where council members can say what we would like to see on a future agenda item. I brought up flyovers. These are basically overpasses that allow you to circumvent a traffic light. We have one of those in the city of Plano. It's northbound on Preston, crossing 121. So instead of waiting at that traffic light on Preston, you can go left and you can just go straight over 121 into Frisco. But that's the only one. My understanding is that the reason we don't have them is because back in the 80s and 90s, when much of Plano was built out, the retail establishments had strict opposition to flyovers because they wanted people at traffic lights looking at their signage. Well, now everybody at traffic lights is looking at their phone, and you have to honk at them to get them to go anywhere. So the idea, the opposition to flyovers should be reduced. Now, they would be expensive. However, if we can implement those at some key intersections, it might dramatically alleviate our traffic woes. I personally have sat through at least 4 cycles of the light west to east on Spring Creek Parkway, all within Plano. And at rush hour before the pandemic, it was painful, and it will be painful again in the future. So we need to look to the future to see what we can do to mitigate those traffic concerns. The next item was that Mayor Pro Tem Prince requested a report on the impact of the pandemic and COVID on businesses in Plano. We then moved to the regular meeting, and we had a couple of certificates of commendation. The first was for the graduating class of the Plano Citizens Academy. I myself had the privilege of going through this more than a decade ago when it was known as the, about a decade ago, I guess, when it was known as the Plano Citizens Government Academy. And then a certificate of commendation for the 2020 Census Complete Count Committee. Again, thanks to them for all their work. We had 8 items on the agenda for items for individual consideration. One of them took by far the most time. This was the reboot of the proposed independent living project called Kathryn Senior Living off of 121 and Kathryn Lane, which is closer to the west of Custer. and 121. This had come up originally before P&Z, Planning and Zoning, and it had been denied. They appealed to council, the developer appealed to council, but then had requested before it actually came before the meeting that it be remanded back to P&Z. There were a number of concerns they wanted to address. So we never actually discussed it on council other than remanding it back to Planning and Zoning. It went back through Planning and Zoning. The developer did address many of the concerns and really made a significant effort to do so. It passed Planning and Zoning 6-2 most recently and came back before council tonight. Now this was a proposed senior living facility right off 121 with a little over a couple hundred units. And the developer did take great steps to mitigate many of those concerns, such as ensuring that there were no units facing, it's multifamily, but independent senior living exclusively. And there was a housing tax credit applied for, so it would be taxpayer subsidized. But they changed the plan so that there would be no units facing 121. There would be ingress and egress through a right-of-way that they negotiated with the U-Haul to the east, so that they would have an alternative to 121 for seniors driving out. The additional sound mitigation steps, etc. Ultimately, several of us, enough of us I should say, felt that while we appreciated the steps taken by the developer to address all these concerns, the overarching concern was the land use itself. In an expressway corridor, neither the Plano Tomorrow Plan, which was recently repealed, nor the 86 plan, which was amended in 2012, which we're now operating under while we work toward a new plan, contemplated any sort of residential in an expressway corridor. Multifamily, single family, senior, nothing. And the description said that residential is generally inadvisable or inappropriate given the circumstances. We ultimately made a motion to deny that failed 4-4. We then had a little more discussion, had a motion to approve been made, and the vote fell along the same lines. That too would have failed. It would have just been in an impasse. After a little more discussion, another motion to deny was made, and that was ultimately denied 6-2. A couple of us, myself, Councilmember Grady, we both said that the project itself looked good, and the additional steps the developer had taken were deeply appreciated. I started my commentary by noting that when it comes to residential in Plano, we have two tremendous needs. One is smaller footprint, lower cost ownership options for people, and the second is affordable options for downsizing seniors. We have a dearth of that, and we need more. Ultimately, however, we felt that this was not the appropriate place for it in the expressway corridor. We then moved on to item 2, which was much easier, much faster. This was to amend the specific use permit, SUP, for the Salvation Army homeless warming shelter. So normally before tonight I should say, between specific dates, if the temperature fell below 35 degrees, they could open up the warming shelter to up to 100 people. Well, we removed the dates and simply said, if the temperature falls below 50 degrees, then it can open up and accommodate up to 150 people. Now, since it opened over the years, as it becomes more well-known, then it sees higher usage. And they've been creeping up toward that 100-person limit as of this year, pretty close. So we expanded that. They have the capacity. It's still only limited to nights when it falls below 50 degrees, which it was noted that in the study that when it falls below 50 degrees, in particular cold and windy conditions, you can still get hypothermia. And the additional point was that we could open it up when HUD declares a national point-in-time survey. So that passed 8-0. The next item, item 3, I'm pretty proud of this. We had a conversation with Chief Greif on Friday, on the anniversary of 9/11, about the importance of public safety and the support that we give our public safety in Plano. This item was the individual consideration to approve a $13 million expenditure, which was approved in the bond referendum a couple of years ago for the new fire training center in Plano. The presentation Chief Greif went through covered a number of topics, and the thing that stood out most was the quote at the very beginning, for me at least. It said, "Don't train until you get it right. Train until you can't get it wrong." That's a much higher bar. And that's one of the reasons that Plano has the finest public safety in the country. This fire training center was approved 8-0. We then moved to approving the operating budget for the next fiscal year, which starts October 1st, of $605.1 million. That passed 8-0. We then approved the Community Investment Program, CIP, of $298.6 million, approved 8-0. All of that hinges on what was already worked out, which was the new tax rate, property tax rate. The public notice for this after Senate Bill 2 passed last year and really took effect January 1st of this year in 2020 changes the entire calculation by which you're calculating your property tax rate and what that means in terms of changes. So the public notice says that under the new calculation, it is a 2.97% increase. In reality, it's actually about a 1%-ish decrease, tax decrease, and that hinges primarily on Chapter 42 litigation. So in brief, when you've got certain outstanding tax bills and property tax bills that are in litigation, a few other factors, under the old formula prior to the passage of SB 2 last year, which implemented property tax reforms in Texas, you excluded those from the calculation to determine whether you're keeping taxes flat from one year to the next. Now they're added back in, and there are numerous other changes to the calculation. I mean, the bill was more than 100 pages, I think 113 pages, if I recall correctly. So there's a lot that went into it. But the reality is that with the new tax rate, Plano homeowners are actually getting a slight tax cut. Very, very slight. Don't get too excited. It's an average of a $16 tax cut. That's because we're keeping our actual tax rate flat. Now remember, the tax rate and the tax burden are two very different things. If your home value doubles year over year and the tax rate stays the same, then your taxes are going to double because it's a two-part equation. However, the average home price in Plano actually declined a little bit, about 1% over last year, from $379 and change to $375,000. So when we keep the tax rate the same, then that means you're going to get a very slight tax cut. That passed 8-0, which means we have had the equivalent of the effective tax rate now for 2 years in a row in Plano. Lastly, we ratified the fact that, and this is required under state law, we ratified the fact that we took in more property tax revenue this year than we did last year. Because we adopted the effective tax rate last year and kept taxes on existing homeowners and property owners flat, not just homeowners, property owners. What that means is we had more property come online, which brought in additional revenue, and that passed 8-0. We have many things upcoming on the Plano City Council. At the next meeting, we will be looking at a proposed ordinance to implement campaign finance reforms in the city. Stay tuned for that. We'll have a lot of stuff coming up. We're going to have a discussion on backyard hens revisited in probably a couple meetings from now. But it's never a dull moment. Stay safe, stay healthy, and get those businesses open. God bless.